She was not a nice person, but she cleaned up the floor. She was not a nice person, but she bandaged my foot in a white piece of cloth and gave us 2 of her own clean shirts to wear. They hung past our knees. She combed or cut the tangles out of our hair, which took ages, and then she made a big pan of scrambled eggs. "It's all the food I have," she said. "I haven't been shopping this week. I wasn't expecting you." All the food she had, she said, except there was butter on the slightly stale bread and sugar in the tea. The eggs looked slimy, but I was hungry enough to eat anything, and they tasted fine. When I wiped my plate with my bread, she gave me another spoonful of eggs. "What am I supposed to do with you?" she asked. It was such an odd question. "Nothing," I said. "Ada stays inside," Jamie offered. "I take care of him," I said. "You won't have to." Miss Smith frowned. "How old are you?" This question made me squirm. "Jamie's 6, I said. "Mom said he's got to go to school." "He's awfully small for 6, Miss Smith said." Mom said, "And surely you're older than he is," she continued. "Don't you go to school?" Jamie said, "Not with that ugly foot." Miss Smith snorted. That foot's a long way from her brain. She tapped her knife against the edge of her plate. "Birthdays. When? Names. Real names, not this Smith nonsense." "Ada and Jamie," I said. "Smith, that's all I know." She glared at me. I glared back. After a few moments, her gaze softened. "You really don't know?" I looked at the eggs on my plate. "I asked once," I said. "Mom said it didn't matter." Miss Smith drew in her breath. "Okay," she said. "Jamie's 6. You're older. Shall we say 9? I couldn't tell by her voice how angry she was. I shrugged. 9 was fine. I knew my numbers, 8, 9, 10. "I'll write your parents," Miss Smith said. "Lady Thornton will get me their address, and I'll write them. They'll tell me." She looked us up and down. "What does your father do?" "Nothing," I said. "He's dead. Dead for years. Either that or gone. I didn't know which. If I squeezed my eyes shut and concentrated, I thought I could remember him, but only as a sort of blurry shadow. A tall man, quiet, not like Mom." "Oh," said Miss Smith. "I'll write your mother then." Miss Smith was not a nice person, but the bed she put us in was soft and clean, with smooth, thin blankets and warm, thicker ones. She pulled the curtain across the window to shut out the light. I was so tired. "Miss," I asked, "whose is the pony?" I had to know before I went to sleep. Miss Smith paused, her hand on the curtain. She looked out the window. "His name is Butter," she said. "Becky gave him to me." "Who's Becky?" Jamie asked, but she didn't reply. Chapter 8. In the morning we slept until the sun was halfway up the sky. Miss Smith slept late too. I could hear her snoring in the room across the hall. I took Jamie downstairs and fed him bread. I crawled again the way I did at home. I meant to keep walking, but crawling was so much easier. The main room had a back door. Outside was a little space fenced by a stone wall, and then another, much bigger space, also fenced. The pony named Butter stood in the bigger space, facing the house, eyes and ears alert. I smiled. He looked like he was waiting for me. Jamie said, grabbing my arm, "You're not supposed to go outside." I shook him off. "That's over," I said. "Here, I can go where I like." He wavered. "How do you know?" It was my reward, I thought, for being brave. For walking so long, for walking away. I got to keep walking forever. I hauled myself to my feet. I would walk to the pony. I toddled and stumbled. Everything hurt. The pony watched me. When I reached the stone wall, I sat on it and swung my legs over to the other side. The pony stepped toward me, lowered his head, sniffed my hands, and pressed his neck against me. I put my arms around him. I understood how he got his name. He smelled like butter in the hot sun. I wanted to ride him, but wasn't sure how. His back was a long way from the ground, plus the girl I'd seen had had straps or something to hold on to. I stood holding on to the pony's neck and took a few cautious steps along his side. The grass in the field prickled my bare feet. The dampness felt cool on it and seeped through the bandage on my other foot, too. The ground was soft. It moved when I stepped on it, squishy like new bread. Trees bordered the field, and their tops waved in the sun. Birds twittered. I knew about birds. We had them in the lane, but I'd never heard so many at once. There were flowers. Jamie ran around the field, singing to himself, whacking things with a stick he found. Butter lowered his head again, sniffing my hands. Did he think I'd brought him something? Should I have brought him something? What did ponies like? The end of his nose felt soft and warm. I traced my hands up his head to his ears and the clump of long hair between them. I rubbed his neck. And he sighed and leaned into me again. Then he took a step away and went back to eating grass. I sat down in the field and watched him. He ate as though eating was his job in life, as though he was saying, "I'm not all that hungry, mate, but I've got to keep on with it, see?" He flicked his tail back and forth, then took a step, dragging himself to fresher grass. I sat and watched him, and then I lay down. It was so stiff, and the warm sun felt so nice. I watched him, and then I fell asleep. When I woke, Miss Smith was standing over me. "You're sunburned," she said. "You've stayed out too long." I sat up, stretching. Everything ached. The skin on my bare legs had turned pink. It hurt, but I was used to things hurting. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked. She sounded cross. I blinked. I was hungry, crashingly, achingly hungry. I was used to that, too. What was I supposed to say? Did Miss Smith want me to be hungry or not? "Why didn't you wake me this morning?" she said. I'd never wake her. I wasn't stupid. "Come." She reached an arm toward me. It's gone late. I've got to get you to the doctor, and we need to do some shopping." "I don't need help," I said. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, and hauled me up. I tried to shake her off, but my foot ached so terribly that in the end, I let her help me back to the house. Jamie was already inside, sitting at the table, eating canned beans and toast. I slid into a chair in the kitchen. Miss Smith thumped more beans onto a plate. "Your bandage is filthy already," she said. I took a deep breath. Before I could speak, Jamie said, "I told her she wasn't supposed to go outside." "Rubbish." Miss Smith's tone was sharp. "Of course she may go outside. We just need a better system. Those shoes you were wearing yesterday." "Those were Mum's," I said. "I could see they weren't yours," Miss Smith said. "Though I don't suppose you can wear a regular shoe." I shrugged. "Well, we'll see what the doctor says. I've hired a taxi to take us there, and then we'll come up with something. Don't get used to it. I can't afford cabs very often." I nodded because that seemed best. It turned out that taxi and cab were both words that meant automobile. 2 rides in 2 days. Astonishing. I knew what a doctor was, though I'd never seen one before. This one had funny things like panes of round window glass stuck in front of his eyes. He wore a long white coat like the butcher back home. "Hop on up here," he said to us, patting a big wooden table. Jamie hopped, but I couldn't. Ah, said the doctor, noticing my foot. He lifted me onto the table. Mom never touched me unless it was to hit me. Jamie hugged me, but of course he never picked me up. People were all the time touching me here. I didn't like it, not at all. The doctor poked and measured and inspected Jamie and me. He made us take off our shirts, and he held a cold metal thing to our chests with tubes that ran up to his ears. He ran his hands through our hair and studied the scratchy places on our skin. Impetigo, he said. This made no sense to me, but Miss Smith pulled a little notebook out of her purse and wrote something down. They're pretty severely malnourished, he said. Looks like rickets starting in the girl. Lots of sunlight for her. Good food. Milk. But what to do with them, Miss Smith said. I've never been around children. Feed them, bathe them, make sure they get plenty of sleep, the doctor said. They're no more difficult than puppies, really, he grinned. Easier than horses. The horses belonged to Becky, Miss Smith snapped. And I never had a dog. Who's Becky? Jamie asked. I shushed him. And what about Ada's foot? Miss Smith said. What am I supposed to do about that? I tucked my foot beneath me. Miss Smith tapped my knee. Show him, she said. I didn't want to. I didn't want them touching me more. My foot was out of sight, bandaged, and I was managing to walk some. But I thought that ought to be enough. Miss Smith yanked my foot out. Behave, she said. The doctor unwrapped the bandage. My, he said, cradling my foot in his hand. An untreated clubfoot, but I've never seen one before. I thought club feet were rather common, said Miss Smith. Oh, yes, certainly, but nearly always successfully resolved in infancy. Miss Smith sucked in her breath in a way I didn't understand. But why wouldn't? She looked at me and made her voice stop. Successfully resolved, I thought. My foot was not successfully resolved. It sounded like I'd done something wrong. Mom always said my foot was my fault. I'd always wondered whether that was true. And clubfoot. That was my foot. A clubfoot. The doctor poked at my clubfoot and twisted it and stared until I couldn't bear it anymore. I thought of Butter, how he smelled so warm and good, how his breath felt against my hand. Instead of going to an empty place in my head, now I could go to where Butter was, and that was easy. Ada, Miss Smith said loudly. Ada, come back. Dr. Graham asked you a question. She was tamping my face. The doctor had wrapped my foot in a fresh bandage. It was over. Are you in very much pain? He repeated. How much was very much? What did he want me to say? I shrugged. Did you understand what he said about seeing a specialist? Miss Smith said. I looked at her. She looked back. Yes or no, she said. I shook my head. Miss Smith and the doctor exchanged glances. I felt like I had said the wrong thing. Dr. Graham thinks a specialist might be able to operate on your foot. I didn't know what a specialist was. I didn't know what they meant by the word operate, but I knew better than to ask questions. Okay, I said. Miss Smith smiled. It sounds scary, I know, but it would be a wonderful thing. I will write to your mother right away to ask her permission. I can't imagine she'll object. Meanwhile, Dr. Graham's fetching a pair of crutches for you. Crutches were long pieces of wood you stuck under your armpits, so you could walk using the crutches and one good foot. Your bad foot, if you had one, didn't have to touch the ground at all. Crutches didn't hurt. The doctor said, see? I knew she could smile. And Miss Smith shook her head and said, I don't believe it. The doctor's place was right in town, near the train station. On crutches, I didn't need a taxi, So we walked right down the main street. I walked down the street, bad foot and all, and nobody stopped me. We went into the shops and bought meat and veg and groceries. I went into the shops and no one turned me out. At one point, Miss Smith said, "Ada, would you hand me 3 of those apples?" I'd been careful not to touch anything up until then, but when she asked, I figured it must be okay. And I did it, and it was. The shopkeeper didn't even look at me. The shops had so much stuff in them, they gave me a jittery feeling. There was too much stuff to see, and I'd never known anyone to buy as much food as Miss Smith did, all at once. She paid for it too, straight up with cash. Not a thing on tick. I nudged Jamie, and he nodded. Miss Smith was rich. On the sidewalk, Miss Smith counted her remaining coins inside. She led us into a stern-looking brick shop. The inside was just people standing behind counters. You couldn't tell what they were selling at all. "What's this place?" Jamie asked. "It's a bank," Miss Smith said. "You've been to banks before?" I didn't know why she'd think so. I'd never even heard of a place called a bank. Miss Smith scribbled on a scrap of paper and gave it to one of the men behind the counter, and he counted out money and gave it to her. "A money store," Jamie whispered, eyes wide. I nodded. We sure didn't have one of those on our lane. We were back wearing our clothes from the day before. We couldn't have gone into town wearing only Miss Smith's shirts, but Miss Smith had washed them so we looked and smelled nice. She marched us into a store that sold clothing anyhow and bought us each a new set of clothes, top and bottom, and something called underwear, which she said we had to wear from now on. 3 sets of that, and stockings and then shoes for both of us, Jamie and me. "I got shoes already," Jamie said, eyeing the stout boots Miss Smith chose. "And Ada, she don't need 'em." Miss Smith ignored him. The shopkeeper, an unpleasant man with hairy eyebrows, said, "These evacuees is nothing but trouble, isn't they, miss? My missus is that fed up already. She's wanting to send 'em home. Filthy little rats wet the bed." Miss Smith gave him a look that made him shut his mouth, except he begged her pardon first. And when we walked out the door, I had a brown leather shoe on my good left foot. A real shoe for me. Miss Smith had to buy a whole pair. The man wouldn't sell her just one. She carried the other shoe in a bag. "We'll save it," she said. "Perhaps someday." I didn't know what she meant, and I didn't ask. I was getting tired, even with the crutches, and I only wanted to think about the walk home. But Jamie danced in front of me, smiling. "If they can fix your foot," he said. "If they can fix it." I smiled back at him. Jamie was such a hopeless fool.